Lord Benedict reached for the handle of the door that led to his private chapel, and paused at the thread of sound slipping around the poorly sealed doorframe. The voice was sweet and female, singing a Christmas carol. He allowed his hand to rest on the heavy iron ring for a moment, while he stood, listening. The voice belonged to his guest, no doubt. She seemed to prefer the quiet of the chapel to the noise of the great hall. When the verse had finished, Benedict pulled on the door and stepped inside. She stood before the altar, her short dark hair uncovered from the wimple, arms uplifted. A plain gown trailed behind her on the floor, surrounded by chilly stone walls. Her voice seemed to suggest that of a bird trapped inside, perhaps tricked by the reflection of light against the 2 glass windows. At the sound of the door, she hastily covered her hair and turned around. Catching sight of Benedict, she dropped a quick curtsy and smiled. "Good evening, sir. I hope I did not disturb." Benedict felt his heart twist at the greeting, and he hoped his own smile was equally pleasant. She seemed so very sincere, which was what galled him the most. When her hood and wimple were in place, one couldn't see the tiny scar that was the only sign of her mark. The smile, the light in her eyes, the sweetness in her voice. How could such a wonderful creature be spawn of the devil? No, sister," he replied quickly. "Merely coming to see if you would join us in the hall for the Christmas revels." "The offer is a kind one, Lord," she replied. "But if it please you, Lord, perhaps it were best I should remain behind. Your young son seemed overly taken with me, and I fear that he should give unintentioned alarm by his joy." Benedict searched his thoughts. What had he been told? Yes, that creatures of hell refused to join in revels of Christian festivals, for it pained them. Yet here she was in the chapel singing holy songs. But he had been warned that her kind was particularly skilled in misleading good Christians into thinking that they were no different than any other. And she spoke of little Hugh. How fortunate he had been to learn of her foul intentions before she had been able to corrupt his boy. His mortal son, born not long after Benedict's embrace, was his greatest treasure. It would be up to him to keep the land when Benedict was forced to retire from the public's eye. The young woman gave him a critical look. "Lord, what troubles you? You seem uneasy this evening." Nay, only distracted. My business weighs heavily upon me." "Of course, my lord," she answered, and in her answer, Benedict felt cold blood sweat creeping beneath his tunic. She didn't believe him. He was certain of it. Genevieve frowned internally. Such formalities were so unlike Benedict, especially after all that they had endured together in the last few weeks. She wondered what had gone wrong to make him act thus. Had his mortal wife accused him of infidelity with her? The very thought was ridiculous. Yet the ultimate proof of its impossibility would also be her death warrant. Benedict considered his next move carefully, not wanting to reveal his intentions or resolve. He had been warned about how clever those creatures were, and he had innocents in his castle whose safety he had to consider. "I merely wish to see if you would be joining us. I'm sorry to have disturbed you." He turned away from her when an idea came to him. He had to be certain the demon could not get away. Yes, and he had just thought of the perfect place to keep her until such time as she could be fetched by those who could deal with her. "Now I recall why I sought you," he said with forced jollity. "I received a most interesting letter from someone who claims knowledge of one of your brethren. It is in my study, if you would see it." Bright joy came to her eyes, and for a moment Benedict thought that perhaps his source had been mistaken. There was no trace of malice in that smile, only true happiness, that of a loving sister seeking information about her lost ones. Perhaps she was as innocent as she claimed. "A fine Christmas present, indeed," she laughed, and her voice echoed in the chapel. "Thank you, Lord Benedict. I could not ask for a sweeter gift. Might I?" "In my study, on the desk," he replied, his tongue feeling thick. Surely demons did not evince such genuine pleasure and joy over news of lost kin. Surely his visitors were wrong. There was nothing demonic in that blissful face. "Thank you, sir," she said as she curtsied, and then walked quickly to the chapel door. She pulled it open and paused. The flickering torchlight behind her created a strange sort of halo around her head. She smiled gently and her voice was soft, but no less happy. "God keep you, Lord Benedict." The chapel door swung shut behind her, with a finality that made Benedict jump. He impulsively crossed himself and whispered, "To save my son. It is not murder, is it?" Genevieve did not need to read further than the first few lines. She had seen the same sort of letter before in other places. They began with the same platitudes and appeals for reason, followed with warnings, followed with threats, and closing with apologies, and no guarantees of safety in the event that warnings were not heeded. As if she needed further proof. The seal at the bottom of the letter damned it as work of the 𝗟𝗾𝗂. She hurried out of the study, clasping her hands tightly before her in an attitude of benevolence, although it was more to keep them from shaking. She believed that Benedict must have thought that she would be distracted by such a trick long enough to spring the trap around her. What had they told him this time? They often tailored their lies to suit the situation. It wouldn't be beyond them to claim that she was to deliver little Hugh for a blood sacrifice, or seduce his servants for unspeakable pagan rites. She bit her lower lip to distract herself from dwelling on the matter. Benedict had seemed like such a sensible man when she had come to his manor for the first time. He had withstood their threats and bluster for so long. Did the monsters not even pause to honor the holiest of days? A chamber was in another tower, and her belongings were packed, as they always were. Would she be able to dodge their servants, placed at strategic points around the castle, long enough to fetch her bundles and rush out the back door? "Sister!" Genevieve felt her breath catch reflexively. The childish voice belonged to little Hugh, who had taken a distinct fancy to her in the days following her arrival. She had so hoped that she wouldn't see him before she departed. Swallowing the choking fear that came to her throat, she turned towards him, hoping that he wouldn't notice her chilly hands and face. Given the circumstances, using blood to warm herself and flush her face would have been dangerously wasteful. Hugh, a dark-haired boy of 6, pulled away from his nurse and rushed to embrace Genevieve around the waist. "Sister, you have come to hear the singing for Christmas. The brothers sing so sweet." He fought to control rising tears and returned the hug as much as she dared, bending down over the cap of his dark hair. "Of course I will, Hugh. I have something to do for your father first, and then I shall be along. Go with your nurse, and I shall see you then." Genevieve caught the nursemaid's eye as she looked up then. and in the mortal woman's gaze was something unreadable. For a moment, Genevieve wondered if it was pity, and she appealed to it, perhaps sensing what needed doing. The nursemaid led Hugh away to the main hall. Genevieve's footfalls made a noise no greater than falling dust as she hurried down one flight of stairs, in and out of shadowed corners, and up the next set of stairs. The door gave way quickly, and she took in the scene from the vague lighting falling from the entrance. A bundle lay just inside the door, ready to be seized. She snagged it, and then a vice-like grip clamped around her wrist, nearly breaking it. She screamed and pulled back into the stairway, fighting the grip on her. No, it would not end like this. But whoever held her was determined not to loosen his hold. There was only one way to loosen then. Steering herself, Genevieve seized the dangling sleeve and pulled the arm, still seemingly having no owner attached to it, towards the flame beside the door. Closing her eyes briefly so she would not see, the smell of cooking canine flesh sickened her, but not as much as the unearthly shriek of agony and rage that accompanied it. Her fingers had some trouble loosening from the sleeve, for they cramped from clutching it so tightly. But Genevieve got away and sped down the stairs. She hugged the bundle tightly to her chest, as the only remembrance of her sire and kin were within. By now, shouts were heard in the castle. They must have set their servants in a dozen places, and the shriek had no doubt warned them that she was not going to be taken easily. She could hear the sounds of men-at-arms moving, trying to cut off her escape. At the bottom of the stairwell stood one of the servants. "Sister, why are you—" was all the old woman had time for before Genevieve moved her out of the way. She could see the great doors of the hall. If she could just reach them, she would be safe. If she could just reach them, she would be free. A dark figure, clad in black and silver, stepped in front of her, holding a struggling child. You. The man was short and slender and wore a heavy silver chain. He was smiling. "Sister," he said with a voice full of malice, "surely you're not going to run off without seeing Hugh, like you promised?" "Oh, by all means, continue running. Continue, and I'll tear the boy's arms off." Genevieve skidded to a halt on the stone floor. She could hear others spilling into the chamber behind her, others who had seen the 𝗟𝗏 threatening the boy. "Just don't hurt him," she said. "Put the boy down, and I'll let you take me." "What are you doing?" her mind screamed at her. "Will you give yourself up for just one boy?" She took a measured step forward, and then another, clutching her precious parcel to her chest. She saw Benedict, ashen-faced at the side of the hall. "Oh, very good, sister," the 𝗟𝗏 said. "Just walk slowly this way. Soon you won't be troubling Lord Benedict any longer." She took a step closer, and another one. The warlock dropped Hugh to the ground and offered his hand to her in a mockery of the courtier's graceful gesture. "No!" She screamed and struck the 𝗟𝗏 with all her might. He staggered back. Hugh ran for her, screaming her name. Genevieve lifted him to her and quickly towards the door. The 𝗟𝗏 made as if to seize her, but Benedict's crossbowmen trained their weapons on the Cainite, and he reconsidered. The hall fell silent. The boy clung to her cold frame and whimpered. "Hugh is going with me, my gracious host, for at least a little while," Genevieve finally said. "I wish him no harm, but I need to ensure my safety from your other guests." Your son will be returned to you, unharmed, unless he chooses to journey on with me. I trust you have no objections." Benedict's gaze was ice cold. His eyes wandered from Genevieve's face to that of her assailants, before finally settling on the boy.
"My lord,"
one of his soldiers said uncertainly,
"shall we open the door and let her go?"
Benedict said flatly,
"And God have mercy on your soul if you don't return him."
"God have mercy on yours, Lord Benedict," Genevieve replied, and still holding Hugh, walked out into the night. She was not surprised when she heard fighting break out behind her, but she never looked back. Neither did Hugh.